Watching this film and hearing about the painstaking amount of time it took to apply the makeup for the Wolfman, obviously it fills me with a sense of awe and appreciation, but also it makes me think, man, you could have just hired a body double. You could have just had me do it. I haven't shaved in a while. I could Wolfman it. I could totally Wolfman it. I mean, who knows? Maybe I am a Wolfman. Maybe I am a werewolf. Good thing it's not a full moon the night that I'm recording. Hey everyone, I'm Ben, your underground conductor, and welcome to Underground Cinema. This week, to celebrate the recent release of the new horror remake from writer-director Leigh Whannell, we'll be taking a look at the Universal Monster Movie Classic, The Wolfman, from 1941, which I actually have here on Blu-ray. This case actually contains all 7 Universal werewolf movies from their monster era. It actually came with this beautiful box set that Universal released, 7 years ago now. It comes with all 30 of their classic monster movies from actually let me look at this, 1931 to 1956. And the box art is absolutely beautiful, all black and white. Even the Blu-ray case is gray instead of blue. Oh, wait. See? Anywho, when it comes to The Wolfman, I think it is worth noting that this movie actually is not Universal's first werewolf movie, as opposed to popular belief. Universal actually came out with a different werewolf movie 6 years earlier in 1935 called Werewolf of London. Unfortunately, that particular film was not as successful as The Wolfman, therefore it is not as well remembered. Of course, speaking as someone who has watched both films, I completely understand why, because The Wolfman from 1941 is just a better movie. It really surprised me, actually, how good this movie really is. Now, I'll preface this by saying that I had never seen the original Wolfman. This was actually my first time watching the Wolfman, preparing to do this review. I know that makes me like a fake film fan, but in my defense, I was a Frankenstein kid. I remember, ordering the Frankenstein DVDs from Netflix and just watching them over and over again. I just loved the overall design of the character. I think it looks just so amazing. I actually read the original Mary Shelley novel, I think, when I was in 6th grade. And I'm the only guy in the world who actually likes the Aaron Eckhart movie I, Frankenstein. So Frankenstein was always my favorite Universal monster. Everything else was just kind of floating around it for me. But sitting down to watch The Wolfman, it just made me grow an even deeper appreciation for this particular era of filmmaking. And it really just makes me want to sit down and binge the other 5 movies that I haven't seen. But, it's easy to say, oh, well, this movie's really old. That means it's really good, right? It must be better than a modern movie. It's really easy to just sit down and say that because the movie is obviously a classic. But what actually makes The Wolfman good? Well, interestingly enough, what makes The Wolfman good, I feel, is the fact that it's actually a really compelling character drama. Let me elaborate. So when the film opens up, obviously we get one of the classic Universal logos. I think it was their second or third logo, before pivoting into the opening credits. Now, this was obviously in that era where you put all the credits at the beginning of the film. And watching through them, I was really hoping that they wouldn't spoil the makeup of the Wolfman. Obviously, the look of the Wolfman is iconic, and I already knew what it looked like before I sat down and watched the movie. But I always try to put myself in the headspace of someone watching a film when it actually came out. And I wanted to see if they would give us a peek at the makeup early. And pleasantly, to my surprise, they didn't. When we get to the credit for the actor Lon Chaney Jr., who plays the Wolfman in this, he's credited as the Wolfman, but they show him in his human form. So already the movie's off to a great start. But then we get into the film itself, and the opening shot of the film is a dictionary definition of the term lycanthropy, which in this film is defined as a mental disorder that's adjacent to schizophrenia, where a human being can begin to exhibit animalistic qualities because they believe that they're transforming into an animal. The definition also elaborates on the fact that many small communities still cling to the superstition of the actual werewolf, relating to mysticism as opposed to mental illness. After we see this definition, we're introduced to our main character, Larry Talbot, played by Lon Chaney Jr., as he's making his way to his family castle. Now, during this scene, I couldn't help but chuckle because when you see him in the car driving, they're using the car rear projection technique where they just project an image behind a fake car and then put the actors in a set to make it look like they're driving. You've seen this in so many films. I think the James Bond movies were most famous for doing this. And obviously, for the time, I think it was a spectacular special effect. But unfortunately, I have grown up in an era where people just make fun of old film techniques, including that. I've seen the car rear projection effect parodied and made fun of in so many different comedies, video essays, even TV shows, like South Park. But obviously, that's not the movie's fault. That's just the era that we live in, unfortunately. But moving on, Larry eventually makes it to Talbot Castle, and that's where he reacquaints himself with his father, Sir John Talbot, played by Claude Rains. Claude Rains actually being a Universal Monster veteran himself, playing the original Invisible Man in the 1933 film. He also played Captain Louis Renault in Casablanca, so the man's a great actor. But Larry reacquaints himself with his father, who he's been estranged from for nearly 2 decades. The reason Larry has returned to Talbot Castle is actually to mourn his brother, his older brother, who recently died. Now, obviously, this reunion between father and son is already emotionally strained due to their estrangement, but adding the brother's death on top of that creates a layer of complexity, because now the estate is left without an heir. So by default, as the only other son of Sir John Talbot, Larry has to now assume the role of heir to Talbot Castle. Larry's father obviously addresses this awkwardness and references the fact that in aristocratic situations like this, the younger brother can feel resentful of his subordinate position and feel compelled to pull away from family, which is pretty much what Larry did. He hasn't been home in nearly 20 years. But the father and son both pledge to each other to make an effort to close this gap that they have with each other. After this reunion, we see Larry and his father touring around with a telescope upstairs. Larry references the fact that he worked in a laboratory for a while, so he has some familiarity with astronomy, but he considers himself to be an amateur. But then Sir John says that when it comes to astronomy, we're all amateurs. There's only one professional, which I think is a really clever piece of dialogue. It's very well written, very subtle. Obviously, you can tell that he's referring to God as the professional, but it also hints at Sir John's character in the sense that he is a rationalist, but also does have a sort of underlying religious belief. And later in the film, we can see that that belief is more pragmatic than anything. Still, interesting nonetheless. Anyway, Sir John leaves the room, and Larry starts looking through the telescope. And he starts looking around this village that he will soon rule over. And looking around, it's very obvious that this film was shot on the Universal backlot. I didn't back this up at all, I didn't look it up. But just seeing the different buildings that Larry looks at in the film through the telescope, I'm 90% sure that the village was just filmed at the Little Europe setup at Universal. And I feel like any person who's ever been on the Universal Studios tour would just get exactly what I'm talking about. That all being said, Little Europe in the Universal Studios backlot is an amazing filming location. All the sets there are deliberately built to look like an old Gothic European village. And they've shot so many classic films there, as well as more modern projects. I mean, hell, they shot The Good Place there. But he's looking around this village, and then his eye gets caught by a beautiful woman, because of course it does. And he's like, ooh, she looks nice. And then he motions the telescope down to see if he can make out the building, and sees that she's in the 2nd floor of an antique shop. So he walks over to the antique shop, goes in, acquaints himself with this woman, and begins laying on the charm. Of course, this was 1941, so flirting at the time basically amounted to mild stalking. Larry asks her if he could buy a pair of earrings, and and he says specifically that he'd like a pair of earrings that look like a half moon. And the woman, whose name is Gwen, replies, well, I don't think we have anything like that. And then he says, oh, yes, you do. You have it upstairs in your bedroom. And when I heard that, I was like, oh my god. It's really awkward. Like I said, I tried to place myself in the time a movie was made when I watch it, but it's really tough to hear something like that in the post-Me Too era and just not have so many red flags go off. And then he just passes off this information as, oh, well, I'm psychic. And obviously this is just all an effort to see if he can woo this woman that he just met. He then proceeds to ask her out repeatedly and says, oh, I'll pick you up at 8. Oh, I'll come here at 8, blah, 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 blah. And she just repeatedly says, no, 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 I won't do that. And on the one hand, I get it. If you're a guy and you're approaching a woman that you're attracted to, there's a certain level of difficulty that you have to overcome, and there's a certain level of persistence that should be allowable. But it just feels like the character just started off immediately on the wrong foot. And if it weren't for the fact that Lon Chaney Jr. was actually an incredibly charismatic actor, I really don't feel like this scene would have worked on any level. Fortunately, Lon Chaney Jr. genuinely was an incredibly charismatic actor, and I'll get deeper into his performance later. Anywho, before Larry leaves the antique shop, he does make a purchase. He purchases a black cane with a silver head in the shape of a wolf. And Gwen explains that this cane is meant to be a reference to the werewolf legend that's very prevalent in the area. Anywho, Larry leaves the antique shop, but comes back later at 8 o'clock, just like he said he would. He's there with the cane that he bought at the antique shop, and obviously he takes the cane to show, oh, I'm invested in this. Gwen's locking up the shop, and Larry's all like, oh, let's go for a walk. And, the date plan is essentially to get their palms read by some local gypsy fortune tellers who have come into town. Of course, Gwen has backup and says to Larry, oh, well, my friend Jenny here also wanted to get her fortune read. Why doesn't she come with us? And I really like this moment because it gives the character of Gwen a certain level of agency. Obviously she kept on saying no to the date earlier, but she recognizes that Larry is persistent, and she prepares for this, and basically sets up an avenue to cockblock him. Not only do I think it's funny, but I think it actually adds a lot to her character. Anyway, the three of them walk into the woods to the gypsy cart, and that is where they meet the fortune teller, Bella, played by Bela Lugosi, the original Universal actor for Dracula. Jenny goes in first to get her fortune read, and recognizing the situation, Larry takes an opportunity to say, hey, Jenny probably wants her fortune read in private, why don't we go for a walk, just the two of us? Which, it's clever. I can't even be mad at it. It's clever. So the two of them go for a walk, and that is where we find out that Gwen is actually engaged. She's engaged to a man named Frank. And she's panicking for a moment because she's wondering why she would agree to go out with someone who's not her fiancé. And all this just adds layers of complexity to her character, which I really enjoy. It shows that her character isn't just a prop in the story, an object of desire. She's her own person with her own desires. And the fact that she as a character is having sort of this internal crisis, but still made the active decision to go out in the evening with Larry Talbot, I think it gives her character an interesting level of agency, and makes her question whether or not she is with the right man. I also do want to give Larry some props during this conversation, because while him and Gwen are having their exchange, she asks him straight up, are you really psychic? Because earlier he had claimed to be. And he says, no, I just have a really good telescope. And he basically confesses to, spying on her through her window, like George McFly did in Back to the Future. Now, like I referenced earlier, this is, creepy behavior, it's, stalkerish behavior, but I really respect the fact that Larry admits to doing this, because anyone with common sense knows that you cannot build a relationship on lies. You set a poor foundation if you do that. And I think him confessing that does help him build trust with Gwen. And it also helps to add to her own internal crisis of faith, being an engaged woman spending time with someone else. While this is happening, though, we pivot back to Jenny as she's getting her fortune read by Bella. And we see on Bella's forehead that he has the mark of the werewolf, the 5-pointed star, a pentagram. And in this movie, they actually draw the pentagram wrong. They don't include the pentagon in the center of it. But, it's a pentagram. Or a pentacle, depending on, what mythology you read into. Anyway, he has the mark on his head, which symbolizes that he is a werewolf. And just like in the legends set up in this film, he sees the sign of the pentagram in the palm of his next victim, which in this case is Jenny. Following this, Bela ends up transforming into a wolf and he begins to chase Jenny. He chases her to a tree. Jenny screams, obviously, and the screams are heard by both Larry and Gwen. Larry, without even thinking about it, just runs into action, which really shows a certain level of heroism to his character. Obviously, I think part of the reason he did that was to impress Gwen, but still, I do think it says something about him that he just runs into danger without thinking. He sees that Jenny is being attacked by a wolf, and he proceeds to beat that wolf to death with his silver-headed walking cane. Of course, before the wolf dies, he manages to bite Larry in the chest. Larry is in shock, and Gwen, as well as a gypsy woman, help him back to Talbot Castle. We then get the news that Jenny has actually died from the wolf attack. And it's kind of interesting in this scene because you don't see Gwen react. Kind of odd. Like, Jenny was your best friend, and you don't really react to her death. It's weird. Anywho, investigators get to the scene, and they see Jenny's corpse, but next to Jenny's corpse is the corpse of Bela the Gypsy. And they're like, oh, how did this happen? You know, obviously they don't know that Bela was a werewolf. But while they're there, they find Larry Talbot's cane. And they take it to him the next morning and say, oh, we found this, next to a dead gypsy. And they ask Larry, oh, what is this? And Larry replies, oh, well, that's the cane I used to kill the wolf. And, obviously at this point they're suspicious. It's like, well, it was the heat of the moment. Did he accidentally kill a gypsy? Obviously, like I said, they don't know that he was a werewolf. But, Larry feels insulted by the implications. And they're like, oh, no, it's fine. Everything's cool. Don't worry about it. Anyway, as the film goes along, Larry begins to feel weird. Even though he says that he was bitten by the wolf, he has no wound. When he goes to see Gwen to see if she's okay, he ends up meeting Gwen's fiancé, Frank. Frank has a dog with him, and the dog just keeps barking at Larry, which I think is a really clever scene, because obviously dogs are intuitive creatures, and I think it shows implicitly that, oh, well, here's one animal, and this animal is threatened by the presence of another animal. Larry also feels a certain level of guilt, because even though he doesn't believe that he killed Bela, he is questioning himself as to why Bela's corpse was there. Then he meets up with Bela's mother later in the film, and Bela's mother explains to him, you did kill my son, but my son was a werewolf. She isn't even upset about it. It's just the way it is. She explains that the only way to kill a werewolf is with silver, and that if you're bitten by a werewolf and you don't die, you become a werewolf yourself. And, we've already started to see the signs of this happening. Larry even has the sign of the pentagram on his chest, which I think is meant to signify that, oh, that's the spot where you were bitten, which I guess means that Bela's character was bitten on the head. But the gypsy woman's all like, listen, very simple, you've been cursed, here's a pendant. She gives him basically like an amulet, and says, wear this, it will keep the curse at bay. Larry doesn't exactly believe this, but he is very concerned over everything that's been going on. So he chooses to give the pendant to Gwen instead and says this will protect you. He then proceeds to kiss Gwen. He kisses an engaged woman. But disarray starts to break out as the gypsy fair that they were all at begins to panic, as all the gypsies begin to pack up their stuff. Larry asks one of them what all the commotion's about, and the gypsy just says to Larry, oh, there's a werewolf loose in the camp. And Larry's just like, what? What? At this point, we're at about the halfway mark of the film, and Larry just goes home. You can just see the fear coming in on his face, and when he gets in, he takes off his shoes, his socks, and then he sees that hair is growing on his legs. An unusual amount of it. We then get this really neat camera fade effect where his legs get hairier and hairier. And, obviously the way that effect is done is that, you just have the actor sitting still while the makeup artist, in this case Jack Pierce, comes in between each shot applying more and more makeup, giving the illusion of the transformation. But then we get to see the full Wolfman walking through the forest on his toes, which is a nice little touch acting-wise, because it gives the illusion of an actual dog walking. But then we get to see the Wolfman in all of his glory. And obviously the look is iconic, it's amazing, but, watching this and Werewolf of London, I look at both designs and I think the one from Werewolf of London is better. You have, the thick sideburns and the deep widow's peak on the forehead. I think it is just a better design. And, that's obviously not knocking the work of Jack Pierce. Obviously, he did the makeup for this film as well as the original Frankenstein. And I do think that the Wolfman makeup looks really well detailed and realistic. But he also did the makeup for Werewolf of London, and even though that makeup is more minimalistic and doesn't have really the same animalistic quality as the Wolfman, I don't know, I just like the design better. That's aside from the point, though. The point is that Jack Pierce is an amazing makeup artist, and this makeup does look amazing. But yeah, at this point in the film, Larry is beginning to transform at night, become a wolfman in the light of the moon, and he starts killing villagers in the night. Now, obviously, Larry has no memory of doing this, but at this point, he's convinced himself that he is suffering from werewolfism, from lycanthropy, and you can just see the growing anguish and concern on his face night after night, day after day. There's a scene where he goes to the funeral of someone who was killed by the Wolfman, and everyone just looks at him with contempt in their faces, because all of this started when he came back home. And you just see the mounting guilt and fear on Larry's face as he eventually just runs out of the church. And that really just goes into how much Lon Chaney Jr.'s performance impressed me in this film. Like most of the actors in this film, they're pretty flat. Like, none of them are bad. Claude Rains, in particular, I think does a really good job as Sir John Talbot. But, this was an era where actors were under contract with certain studios, they worked on a dozen films a year, and oftentimes they were just expected to stand there and deliver lines. But Lon Chaney Jr. doesn't just stand there and deliver lines. He actually puts in the work to convey the emotion in every single scene that he's in, showing the progression of a character who's just living in constant fear of himself in the fact that he cannot control his actions. It's so compelling. And obviously, at this point, he wants help. He confesses his concerns to the local doctor, to his father, but no one believes him. They think it's all in his head. And obviously, if anyone comes to you and tells you, oh, I think I'm turning into an animal at night, you're going to roll your eyes and be like, oh, what's going on here? But I also think that the fact that they don't believe him sort of communicates, the prevailing philosophies of this era. This film came out in 1941. It was near the beginning of the Second World War. Nihilism was beginning to take root in Western culture. People were beginning to abandon religion and superstition in favor of something more rationalistic. Like, there's a heavy emphasis on rationalism in this film, in just trying to explain things scientifically. It's like, oh, these aren't fairy tales, this is real, blah, 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 there's just a wolf on the loose. And I was a little annoyed when I kept hearing this in the film, because I thought to myself, well, there's a disconnect here, because obviously the characters in the movie keep saying, oh, well, this isn't real, but we, the audience, know it's real because we've seen it. But after I sat down and thought about it after watching this film, I realized, oh no, this is really in service of the character story for Larry Talbot in this film. And it's really just contributing to the growing tragedy of his character, the fact that he was estranged for nearly 20 years from his family and his home. And then the moment he comes back, everything just goes wrong. All of it just really makes this character feel like an outcast, like he's a man that doesn't belong anywhere. In any case, though, Larry continues to espouse his concerns, and eventually his father says, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to strap you to a chair. We're going to strap you to a chair, and this is going to prove once and for all that you're not a wolf man. And then his father leaves and says, I'm going to go on the hunt with the other men to catch the real wolf. Which, that was a mistake, buddy. That was just a mistake. While Sir John Talbot is out in the forest hunting for a wolf, he comes across Larry as the wolf man, who obviously broke out of the chair. John, who happens to have Larry's silver-headed cane, then beats the Wolfman to death the same way Larry beat the other wolf to death earlier in the film. The Wolfman then falls to the ground and dies, and then the gypsy mother shows up and gives her condolences to Larry, saying that the road that you walked was thorny and through no fault of your own. And as he dies, we see that the Wolfman slowly transforms back into Larry. And you just see the shock and horror of everyone around, including Sir John, who now realizes that, oh, I just killed my last living son. It's just an incredibly tragic set of circumstances, because none of this was his fault. This all started because he was trying to do the right thing and save a woman's life. But in fighting off a beast, he became a beast himself. It's such a tragic set of circumstances, and my only complaint about this ending is the fact that it's too abrupt. That there should have been an extra couple minutes added in, showing the characters lament the loss of Larry. That being said, I do think it's actually quite touching that the last line of the film comes from the character of Gwen, and it's, oh, Larry. It shows that she truly cared about him. And obviously he truly cared about her as well, despite the fact that he was kind of a creep earlier. Of course, that's just a minor complaint in the grand scheme of things, because The Wolfman is an absolutely amazing film. Like I said, I was really surprised that this film was genuinely this good. There's so much about this film that I really enjoy, like the subtle symbolism here and there, like the fact that the earrings that Larry was talking to Gwen about were in the shape of a half moon, which, obviously werewolves transform in the presence of a full moon, and you have two half moon earrings, two halves make a whole. I also love the inclusion of Bela Lugosi in this film. Obviously, Lugosi was an amazing character actor, but I like the fact that in this film, he's the initial werewolf that turns Larry, because Bela Lugosi's Dracula was the first monster audiences were introduced to in the Universal Monsterverse. So to include him in this film as a werewolf who bites the main character, that's one Universal monster creating another Universal monster. It's sort of like a passing of the torch kind of thing, which I don't know if that was on purpose, but I just think that's so beautifully symbolic. I also love the way that we're initially shown the Wolfman. He's shrouded in darkness, the shadows from the trees obscuring aspects of his face. It makes the details that you can make out even more impactful, like his fangs, his hair, which apparently was all yak hair, his nose, just all incredible work. Jack Pierce was really an icon. Of course, the thing that really carries this film is the central character, Larry Talbot, the Wolfman. And as I've already talked about, Lon Chaney Jr.'s performance in this film is just so profound. He starts off as charismatic and cheerful and happy to be home despite the circumstances, because obviously his brother died. But he just becomes such an anguished character who winds up in such a tragic situation. And Lon Chaney Jr. was just amazing. The command that he has over his facial expressions, it's truly impressive. There's so many moments where it looks like he's about to cry, and you can really feel like how upset he is. And the camera work also adds to that, because in those moments you can see like his eyes sparkling. And apparently in real life, Lon Chaney Jr. was an emotional person. So that is obviously his real life personality bleeding into the character. But you can also see how disturbed he is at several points in this film. Like there's a scene where they're at the Gypsy Carnival, and they're playing a shooting game, and one of the targets is a wolf, and he can't shoot it. Like he gets really upset when he sees that, because at that point, he's still confused about whether he killed Bella the Gypsy or the werewolf. And then the character Frank in that moment makes a shitty comment, and it's like, bro, what are you doing? But yeah, Chaney Jr.'s performance in this film is just so emotionally driven. Obviously this was his debut in the Universal Monsterverse. He'd only done one other horror movie for Universal up until that point, which was Man-Made Monster, a movie that actually came out the same year. But he just fits so well into like the pantheon of these Universal monsters, especially since he was introduced relatively late in their franchise. Like, Universal's first four monster films, being Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, and The Invisible Man, all those movies came out like a decade earlier. And like I mentioned, Universal had already made a werewolf movie before The Wolfman, it just wasn't as successful. So when you consider that The Wolfman became as iconic as those other monsters, despite coming so late, it's truly astonishing, and a lot of that is owed to Lon Chaney Jr.'s performance in this movie, as well as obviously Jack Pierce's makeup. And you can tell that Lon Chaney Jr. put a lot of himself into this character. Like, I watched a couple of the featurettes included on the Blu-ray after I watched this movie, and apparently in real life, Lon Chaney Jr. was kind of like a sweet himbo. Like, he wasn't stupid by any stretch of the imagination, but he was kind of a dopey guy, and he was also really charming. Like, everyone who worked with him loved him, except for Jack Pierce. And you can see that in this film. His performance feels so genuine, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that he's kind of playing himself. And I think the fact that the character of Larry Talbot has an estranged relationship with his father just adds to that. Obviously, Lon Chaney Jr. was the son of famed silent horror actor Lon Chaney Sr., the man of 1,000 faces. But apparently Chaney Jr. never really had a good relationship with his father, especially after he told his father he wanted to get into acting. He wanted to follow in his dad's footsteps, and Chaney Sr. just wasn't having it. He ended up sending his son to plumbing school instead. And then Lon Chaney Sr. died in 1930 at the age of 47. Chaney Jr. was 24 years old at the time, very young man. And to add even more stress on top of that, that was also around the time the Great Depression started. So Chaney Jr.'s plumbing business ended up failing, the business that his father pushed him into. And after all that happened, Chaney Jr. just went all in on acting, because he had no reason not to. And he wasn't even credited as Lon Chaney Jr. at that point. He went by his birth name, Creighton Chaney, because he wanted to go out there and make it on his own. He didn't change his name to Lon Chaney Jr. until his agent suggested it to see if it could get him more work, and it didn't. Lon Chaney Jr. had to fight his way up and develop acting talent before people started to notice him. and eventually it worked. Universal ended up hiring Chaney Jr., the Wolfman was a huge success, and Lon Chaney Jr. ended up playing the various other horror monsters in subsequent films when the original actors refused to come back. Lon Chaney Jr. ended up playing Dracula, he played Frankenstein, he played the Mummy. He created a lasting legacy for himself. But despite that, he never really dug himself out of his father's shadow. And I think the fact that this movie ends with Larry Talbot's father beating his son to death, it's almost like a metaphor for the way Lon Chaney Sr.'s reputation loomed over Lon Chaney Jr. Like, it doesn't matter how high you get, you'll still get beaten down by your father's legacy. Which just adds an extra layer of tragedy to this already tragic film. Moving on from that, though, to something a little more lighthearted, I wanted to get back to Bela Lugosi's werewolf, more specifically his werewolf form. When Bela Lugosi's character transforms into a werewolf, he just looks, well, like a wolf. But when Lon Chaney Jr. becomes a werewolf, he actually looks like a wolf man. He doesn't look like a wolf. He looks like a hybrid between wolf and man, which is how a werewolf should look. But it leaves me to wonder, what happened here? Because we saw Bela Lugosi's werewolf earlier in the film, and he was just a wolf. In reality, they just had a German Shepherd on set, but, it's a wolf. But when Larry transforms, he's not. So, why do they look different? I mean, obviously the real answer is probably that the makeup just took so long to apply that you couldn't do it with two different people. But if we're talking about in narrative, I have a theory. I think that Larry wasn't actually a full werewolf, because he gets handed that pendant earlier in the film by Bella's mother, and that pendant is to keep the curse at bay. And he puts it on initially, but then he takes it off and gives it to Gwen. And that night is the first night he transforms. So what I think happened is that whatever charm was on the pendant was actually working on him, but because he took it off, it didn't work all the way. So he didn't become a full werewolf. He only got part of the way there. So yeah, I don't think Larry Talbot is supposed to be a full werewolf, if that makes sense. Just my theory, could be completely off base on that. Although, side note, the German Shepherd that they did have play the werewolf version of Bela Lugosi, that German Shepherd's name was actually Moose, and after they filmed The Wolfman, Lon Chaney Jr. actually adopted that dog, which I think that's really sweet. I like that. But anyway, I loved The Wolfman. I thought this film was heartfelt, tragic, well acted primarily by Lon Chaney Jr., as well as Claude Rains. The makeup was obviously fantastic, courtesy of Jack Pierce. The cinematography was actually really good, too. Like that one shot of Larry killing Bela Lugosi's wolf character, just slamming the cane, it's framed so well and feels so powerful. And the film is also brief, but not quick, which I appreciate. Like, the film has like a nice even pace. It really walks you through the story of Larry Talbot, but it doesn't patronize you, it doesn't waste your time, it just allows this story to unfold in front of you. And considering how short the movie is, it's actually quite astonishing how much the film does without making itself drag. Like, this movie's only 70 minutes. Like most of the Universal Monster movies. Most of them are like less than 80 minutes. But it's like a short movie. Like, it really does not demand a lot of time for you to watch. And yet it invests you in its narrative anyway, which is just amazing. Like, if I was going to make any complaints, I would say that you could cut out a few lines of dialogue here or there. While I love a lot of the conversations in this film, there's things where you don't really need to explain them to the viewer. But then again, this was 1941, I understand. Bottom line, Wolfman, great movie. Just makes me excited to see Leigh Whannell's version now. So yeah, that was my review of the original Wolfman, and I hope you all enjoyed it. Please feel free to subscribe if you're feeling generous. You can also follow me on Instagram or Letterboxd if you want to hear more of my film takes, and I will see you later.